page. We did this last time, but just a bit of chazara, a bit of review, because then we're going to deal with that the rest of the evening. Okay, when we said the Mishnah said, it's on 10a, said the Mishnah, Peirus alea sadin mipnei hachama or tachter mipnei hanesher. If a person spread a sheet over the top of their kosher sukkah, of their kosher schach, in order to protect it from the sun, so that the schach doesn't dry out. Hi, Paul. Or tachteha mipnei hanesher, or underneath it, in order to protect the people inside the sukkah from any leaves or anything falling onto their table, says Rashi. Or shapiris al gabeha kinuf pesula, or they spread a sheet over a four-poster bed, and then the sukkah is possible. Says the Gemara, says the Mishnah further, aval piris hu al gabe niklatze hamita. However, if they were to only do it over a two-poster bed, so it forms a triangle, there's not a tefach of a roof, then it's absolutely fine. It's not a problem. It's not considered to be an oil. Says Rashi. Look at Rashi towards the bottom of the page. Aval pores, last Rashi before the Gemara. Pores gabi and niklatze she'enan ela shnayim, because there are only two posts. Ve'en yotzim be'emsa mita echad l'meroshoseha ve'echad l'ragleha. So it runs down the middle of the bed, one at the head, one at the foot. And they run a beam across the two, and then they spread a sheet over it. And it slants from one to the other. And since they on the top, the roof of this structure doesn't have a tefach flat area, because it's a point and then sliding away, then it's not considered to be an ohel. It doesn't have the din of a tent, and therefore underneath it, a person can be underneath it and still fulfill the mitzvah of yeshivas b'sukkah. Okay, let's see if there's a tosfos here. Yeah, just at the beginning of the tosfos, I think we may have seen this very quickly last time. I have a look at it this time. The third tosfos, Peirus aleha sadim mipnei hachama. So we said the first case of the mission is to lay a sheet over the top of the schach because of the sun. Says Tosfos, the Gaonim write, when the Mishnah teaches that they spread a sheet over the top of the schach because of the sun, or or below it because of the leaves, that it's possible. That's when we're talking about the sun is greater than the shade. Below sadin, when there's no sheet. So here actually the sheet is actually in some way acting as part of the schach. And since it's makabel tumah, since you can't use a sheet to be part of your schach, then that's why it's possible. Aval im yesh silasa meruba meachama kishera. However, if the shade is already greater than the sunlight before you spread the sheet, and you, as I said at the beginning, and I think Rashi says it here, that the only reason you spread it out is in order to protect the schach from drying out in the heat of the sun, but not to provide you shade within the sukkah, because you already have the requisite amount of shade, then kashera. And then the sukkah is kosher. Veina sadin pusilesa, and the sheet does not cause a psul in the sukkah. V'hainu kamosh parashti le'el, says Tosfos, and this is what I've explained above. De'ein mitzaref schach pasul v'hadei schach kasher. Says Tosfos, this is what I said previously when we talked about this. We had the idea of the tree overhanging, and the intermingling of the leaves of the tree, which are, because they're attached to the ground, they're pasul. However, Tosfos says we can make a chiluk, a distinction, where we can say that pasul schach doesn't join together with kosher schach if the kosher schach is already sufficient to provide you with what you need. Given to below psul silasa miruba, since it doesn't pasul it, because already the shade is greater than the sun. Okay. So so that's what it says. And he actually goes on and says, actually, sorry, it was Rabbi Chapper says, not Rashi. So he said that's what he's saying. That the concern is that because he's concerned that the heat of the sun will dry out the schach and therefore cause it to shrivel, which will mean although previously it was providing enough shade, since it's shriveled, it's leaving more gaps now. And then what will happen is that there'll be more sun than shade. That's what the concern is. Okay, we'll leave the rest of the Tosfos there. Okay, but we're clear on that on what we're saying here. Yeah. Okay, says the Gemara. And we saw this last time. We're just going over this. So says the Gemara. Amar Rav Chista. Rav Chista says, "Lo shanu enim mipnei hanesher, aval neyosa k'sheira." Says Rav Chista, when the Mishnah taught that if you were to put the sheet under there in order to protect you from the falling leaves, it's possible. That was only if it was for that reason. Aval neyosa k'sheira. However, if you can spread a sheet underneath the schach, if it's in order to decorate the sukkah, and then it would be kosher. Says Rav Chista, that's the difference. That's the point the Mishnah is making. That only if you're doing it in order to catch the leaves is it possible. But if you're doing it for decoration, exactly the same sheet. And here it would appear it would be dependent on your kavanah. What was your intention when you put the sheet there? Was it in order to catch leaves, or was it to make the sukkah look nice? If it was to catch leaves, the Mishnah tells us, in that case, and only in that case, the sukkah is possible. But if you put the very same sheet there, but your intention was in order for it to decorate the sukkah, then it's kosher. Says the Gemara, end of the line, pshita, that's obvious. But the Mishnah in fact says that. The Mishnah qualifies its statement and says if you spread a sheet there, why are you spreading it there? In order to protect, in order to catch the falling leaves. That's obvious that's the case. So says the Gemara, who hadin ta'afilu le'ne'osa. Oh, so says the Gemara, oh no, because you might have thought that the Mishnah meant that not only is it possible if you put it there in order to catch the leaves, but also if you put it there as a decoration. And I might have thought the only reason the Mishnah said on account of the leaves is because that's the normal reason why people put it there. That's the normal way why a person would spread a sheet out there. And therefore you might have thought in all cases of spreading a sheet there, it would be possible, even if you only put it there as a decoration. Kamash Malan says Rav Chista, therefore the Mishnah comes to tell you that no, if it's only put there in order for decorative purposes, then the sukkah is kosher. It says the Gemara, Lema Messiah Le. Let's learn perhaps from what's taught in a brisa, where it says, if a person had kosher schach on their sukkah, so 100% kosher schach on sukkah, v'itra bekamin v'sadinin hamud, and then what they did was they hanged from the kosher schach. As Rashi says, what are these things? They are materials, colored materials, woven fabrics, like purely as decorative for decorative reasons, and then other things. V'talaba, and then they hung from it egozim, nuts, shikedim, almonds, afasakin, peaches, rimonim, pomegranates, pachile, anavim, bunches of grapes. If you look in the margin there, it says perish ashkolios shel anavim, so bunches of grapes, shehein karutzim min im zamora. They've been cut together with the bunches, but it means the grapes on them as well. So bunches of grapes. What else? Anavim, shel shibolim, or some sort of like crowns of grain, like sheaves of corn, I suppose, like made into some sort of design. Yenos shmanim v'saltos, wine, oil, and fine flour, says Rashi, last Rashi on the page. Put into glass containers to act as a decoration. So all these types of decorations, all these things are purely for decorative purposes. Says the Brisa, we are forbidden to make use of them, and then turn over to Yud Omid Beis. So you're forbidden to make use of them, says the Gemara, Ad Mosi Yom Tov Achron Shel Chag, until the basically the end, the day after, right at the end of the last day of Sukkot, they are muksa, since they are there for decorative purposes. They were there's hooks and misvasa, they were put there for decorative purposes, not for any use. You cannot make use of them during Sukkot. However, if you make a condition about them, says if you make a condition when you put them up before Yom Tov, then hakolafi tanai, then everything is according to the conditions. Says Rashi on the left hand side, hakolafi tanai, the first Rashi on the page. He said, I'm not setting them aside. Person says, I'm not setting them aside for the whole of the time between Ben Hashmash's twilight or the first day until the end. That there shouldn't be any sanctity attached to them. Look at Tosfos on the right hand side. Tosfos raises an interesting question. He says, the Gemara said, the Brisa said that you cannot make any use of them until completely after the last day of Yom Tov. Says Tosfos, he says later on in the Masechta, on Daf Mem Vav Amud Beis, befarish my shana me esrog to sharib Yom Tov Achron. We'll see there that although an esrog, you cannot have any benefit from an esrog apart from using it for the mitzvah until the last day of Yom Tov. So on the last day of Sukkot, meaning after you use it for the mitzvah, you can then do with it whatever you want. Why not here? Why not here? What's the difference between an esrog on the last day of Sukkot, where you can have benefit from it, whereas these decorations where you have to wait until after Yom Tov to have any benefit from it? What's the difference? So the Gemara says, "Umasik mishum de sukkah." There's a difference between the sukkah and the esrog. Whereas with sukkah, once you've used it on the last day for the mitzvah, you're not going to use it again. There's no use for it, no purpose of it, and therefore you can use it for anything else. However, sukkah, since theoretically Ben Hashmashos at twilight on the last day of Sukkot, if you want to eat, you still have to eat in the sukkah. Therefore, the sukkah and its decorations remain muksa. Says Tosfos, we have a principle is when something is muksa, Ben Hashmashos at twilight, it remains muksa for the whole day. So, I think what Tosfos is saying here is, since if you wanted to eat Erev Erev Sukkos, Ben Hashmashos is not quite night yet, but it's not, if it's not day, it's this twilight zone, you'd have to eat in the sukkah. So since the decorations become muksa at twilight, they remain muksa for the whole time. Aval esrog, the last of the wide lines of Tosfos, Aval esrog, lo chazi ben hashmashos. There's no use for the once you've already used, the esrog for the mitzvah, it no longer has any use for you, and therefore you should be able to use it on the last day of Sukkot for whatever you want. Okay, that's just a side point. I thought it was interesting to see that. Okay, let's go back into the Gemara. So the Gemara has seemed to say that when Rav Chapper said that we make a distinction between things to catch falling leaves and something put there for the sake of decoration, we make a distinction. And here this would appear to be a support for it. Says the Gemara, no. Says the Gemara, Itma, it was said, third line of the Gemara, Noi Sukkah, so second line, middle of the second line. Says the Gemara, Dilma Minat Sad. Perhaps we're talking about when the decorations were put on the sides. This brisa that talks about using eggs and nuts and almonds, etc. All these different things. It was talking about putting these on the walls, not from the schach. Look at Rashi, the last of the wide lines in Rashi. Dilma minat sad, the dafanos ka'ama. Perhaps that brisa was talking about decorating the walls of the sukkah. Avalamala, however, from above, perhaps we would say, according to that brisa, would say, putting on the walls is fine. Putting things which are makabel tumah, which is acceptable to tumah on the walls is absolutely fine. But putting them from the schach, even if they're used for decoration, that you can't do. So you can't bring a support for Rav Chisda from this brisa, because perhaps this brisa is talking about decorating the walls with all these things and not decorating the roof. Okay. Enter the second line. Says Gemara, Itma, noise, it's almost like a side point. Noisukkah ein ma'atzim b'sukkah. The decorations of the sukkah, they don't reduce the height of the sukkah. We talked about this last time. It says Rashi, second of the narrow lines in Rashi, ein ma'atzim. If you put any of these materials to decorate the sukkah underneath the schach, what happens if we know that a sukkah higher than 20 amas is possible? What happens if you say, you know what, I'm going to hang things down from the schach of my apostle sukkah, and since they hang at a height lower than 20 amas, perhaps they will reduce the height of the sukkah and make it kosher. Says the Gemara, no, you cannot use the decorations of the sukkah to reduce its height to make it kosher. Why? Because they themselves are possible as schach. Because since they're made out of things which are makabel tumah, they can't be used as schach, and therefore they can't be included in something. It can't be included in the height of the sukkah, and therefore it won't reduce the sukkah to make it kosher. Also, that's one way around. So that's one way around. To eat schach it's no good as schach because it's makabel tumah. Similarly, also, there's also a benefit to it as well. We know that the minimum height of a sukkah is 10 tefachim. What happens if you've got a sukkah that's just 10 tefachim with the decorations hanging down below that? Does that possible the sukkah or not? Says the Gemara, no. Because since they are not fit to be schach, they're not included in the schach, therefore they're not considered to be at a height lower than 10 tefachim, and therefore they don't posel the sukkah. So that's good news. They don't reduce the height of the sukkah.
When you mentioned the ceiling, you spoke about a sheet or some sort of a covering to protect the leaves, although the kavanah was to make it part of the decoration. So that would be a lower level, won't it? I mean, than the schach itself. Yeah. Is that nifsal? Is that to invalidate the schach?
Okay. So we have to be careful. So we've said, the Mishnah said, if you put it there for protective purposes in order to catch the falling leaves, then it makes the whole sukkah possible.
Yes, I understood that. Yes.
But if you put that there purely for decorative purposes, here we're now saying, even if that reduces the height of the sukkah below the minimum of 10 tefachim, since these decorative materials are makabel tumah, they're possible as schach, they don't possible the sukkah, and they can't be considered to be lowering the height of the sukkah because they can't be counted as schach. And therefore, even though actually the height of the sukkah is lower than 10 tefachim, the sukkah is still kosher.
So it doesn't theoretically disturb the schach as a covering.
It definitely doesn't. It definitely doesn't.
Even though it may actually cover up the schach because it's protecting the falling leaves.
Yeah, hold on, no, you got to be careful. You can't mix up the two things.
I know, and that's why I'm asking. So,
although technically it's covering this, it is underneath the schach and therefore could be catching falling leaves. If you put it there purely for decorative purposes,
like it says, a sheet and a carpet and various drawings and fruit. That's one of the reasons. Okay.
Yeah, if it's there purely for decorative purposes, regardless of whether incidentally it catches the falling leaves, if your purpose was to put it there for decorative purposes, and even if it's lower than 10 tefachim, meaning it reduces the height of the sukkah to less than 10 tefachim, the sukkah is still kosher.
And the schach is still intact.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
However,
you might not see the stars though. That's another problem, right?
Right. No. Yeah.
Does that make the sukkah invalid?
No.
You can't see the stars.
No. As long as the schach,
was the original reason for putting the schach there. Yes.
Yeah. The sukkah was made kosher because the schach was we said kihilchasa. It was correct schach, meaning the shade was greater than the sun, but you could see the stars through it. And then after that, you added in for decorative purposes these sheets. Okay. To block out the light. Not a problem. Not a problem.
Okay. Thank you.
Gemara continues, fourth line down. Umin hadsad mima'atzin. Whereas if you put decorative coverings at the sides of the sukkah, then it does reduce the size of the sukkah, even though these coverings are possible, because we said it doesn't matter what you use for the walls. The walls can be made out of possible material. Says Rashi, umin hadsad here, umin hadsad mima'atim, from the size it does possible. Matim la, it does reduce it. Mishir zayin tefachim. We've said that sukkah minimum dimensions of a sukkah are 7 tefachim square. Because any less than 7 tefachim square, it cannot hold a person's head, majority of their body, and their table. And therefore, even though without the decorations you had 7 by 7, by putting in these decorations, by putting in like false walls, you have reduced the inner airspace of the sukkah, and you've made the sukkah therefore possible. Okay. Let's move on. So Gemara now says, middle of the fourth line, nice interesting story here. Minyamin, Avdei de Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi had a servant called Minyamin. He couldn't afford the base, so he wasn't Binyamin, he was Minyamin. So what happened to him? Says the Gemara, Itamishe lei katanutza b'maya. His shirt became soaked with water, says Rashi. Itamishe nishura b'mayim. It was soaked in water. It got soaking wet one day. So what does he do? V'ishtakta amataltala. He hangs it out on the sukkah. So that he hangs it from the schach of Rav Ashi's sukkah to dry out. Amalei Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi says to him, Dalia, he says, remove it. Take it down in order people shouldn't say, oh, Rav Ashi used something which was makabel tuma for his schach. So says Minyamin, V'akahu chazele derativa. He says, 1 second. Says Minyamin says to Rav Ashi, but people can see that it's soaking wet. They know why I've hung it up there. I'm not hanging it up there to use it as either schach or as a decoration of the sukkah. I'm putting it up there for its own reason, in order that it dries out. Says Rashi, people can see that it's wet. And to the Nagva should talk about Velodischach. People, and therefore that proves to people, it shows, it's quite clearly that it's put there to dry out and not for schach. So says Rav Ashi, Lechi yavsha ka'amin. What I meant was, when it dries, take it down. Says Rashi to Kashla, when it dries. Yeah, so Rav Ashi says, you're right, okay, when it's wet, okay, people know that it's not being used as schach, and therefore there's not an issue. But as soon as it's dry, people won't know why you're hanging it up there. You might be hanging it up there to act as part of the schach. Therefore, you need to take it down. Okay? So it appears from there that so we seem to have like a third situation. It's not being used as schach. It's not being used as noi, as decorations. And it appeared from Rashi was saying that to hang something up there for its own reason, that's permitted. But once it's dry, there's no reason for it to be there. You can't have it up there. Okay, that's what I think we learned from that little incident. Mora carries on. Yeah. Itma says the Gemara. Noi sukkah to muflagin mimena arba'a Rav Nachman amana keshera. Now we're going to deal with a bit more of the dinim of the decorations of the sukkah. Rav Nachman says, also says the Brisa, that if you've got sukkah decorations hanging down more than 4 tefachim from the schach, so there's a gap from the schach to the decorations, they're hanging down more than 4 tefachim, the sukkah is kosher. No, he's not concerned. He's not concerned because they're clearly distinct from the schach, and therefore there's no concern that they are considered to be part of the schach at all. And therefore they're kosher. Rav Chisda v'Rabba bar Rav Huna Amri, Rav Chisda and Rabba bar Huna say, Basula, they say no, that would posel the sukkah. Yeah, look at Rashi. Noi sukkah here, just here. Noi sukkah sadinan haporisin tachas schach lenoi. Again, we're talking about these sheets, these decorative materials which are hanged underneath the schach for decorative purposes. Pusula, according to Rabba and Rabba bar Huna, it will make it possible. Why? Mushum ohel. Because once it's at a distance of 4 tefachim, more than 12 tefachim from the schach, it's distinct now. It has a distinct, these decorations are now a distinct entity, and they are now considered to be an ohel, a tent. Mafsik, which interrupts between the people in the sukkah and the schach. Vishtachach, delo gane besukkah. And people will forget that they're not sitting in the sukkah. Uvel Rav Nachman, kiven de lenoi sukkah yevna batla legaba. Whereas Rav Nachman was of the opinion, since they were put there for the purpose of decoration, then they are cancelled, they are nullified, they're insignificant. Again, because they were put there for decorative purposes, he would say, regardless of how high they are or low they are, they're just nullified. You'll see from the hanging base that we paskin like Rav Chisda, like Rabba and Rabba bar Huna, Rav Chisda and Rabba bar Huna. Yeah, we have to be careful that any decorations are within 4 tefachim of the schach. So there should be no doubt that if it was a certain size, if you were sitting under a decoration which requires substantial size decoration, that's acting as an ohel and blocking you from the schach and therefore apostles the sukkah. Okay. Yeah, let's carry on. So having said that, we see something really interesting, says the Gemara. Yeah, says the Gemara. Yeah, Rav Chisda, so it repeats again here. Rav Chisda for Rabbi Bar Huna, Ikla lebei Reish Galuta. So it once happened, the Rav Chisda and Rabbi Bar Huna went to visit the Reish Galuta. He was the head of the Jewish community in Bavel. Yeah, and Agninhu Rav Nachman Besukkah Shinoi Muflagin Mimena Arba'a Tefachim. And Rav Nachman housed them, he put them up in a sukkah where the decorations were below 4 tefachim. Remember, this is Rav Nachman who said below 4 tefachim is kosher. And this is Rav Chisda and Rabbi Bar Huna who say, no, it's possible. So Rav Nachman is putting them in a sukkah, according to him, is kosher. According to them, it's possible. Just look at Rashi. Rashi tells us why it's significant about Rav Nachman housing them. Let me see where I can find it. Here, Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says to Rashi, Rav Nachman was the Av Beis Din Haya. He was the Av Beis Din. He was the head of the Beis Din in Bavel. V'nagidu mitzavid b'beis rosh gola v'osin al piv. He was director of the Reish Galuta's house, and what he said went. He basically was in charge. Yeah. So they went to visit the Reish Galuta, who was the titular head of Babylonian Jewry. But Rav Nachman was the I suppose it's like the president and the prime minister, right? Or the monarch, and you've got the prime minister. He was the one who wielded the power. Rav Nachman wielded the power. So he put them into a sukkah that the decorations were lower than 4 tefachim. So what happens? Says the Gemara, middle of the line, second word in. Yeah. Ishtiku v'lo amru lei v'lo midi. So Rav Chisda and Rabbi Bar Huna were silent and didn't say a word. They didn't say anything. Even though they disagree with him, they didn't say a word. Sa'amalahu. So they said to him, or he said to them, so Rav Nachman says to them, and again, he had to try and visualize this. Who knows what was going on here, but it would appear like he was trying to sort of test them a little bit. Davka put them into this sukkah where he knows they don't hold by, they would consider it to be possible because the schach is too low. They didn't say a word. So Amalahu, so Rav Nachman says to them, Hador Bahu Rabbanan Mishmatehu. Have you gone back on your opinion? Do you now agree with me? It appears you said nothing. You don't have an issue with it. So Amrulay, so they said to him, Anan shluchei mitzvah. They said to him, no, we are shluchei mitzvah. We are, since we've come to visit the Reish Galuta, we are fulfilling a mitzvah. We are shluchei mitzvah. We are messengers for a mitzvah. Therefore, Anan upaturin min sukkah, and therefore we are potter from sukkah.
So even though it might be apostle, the sukkah might not be. They're getting
That's
out.
What they were saying. The reason why we were silent is not because we agree with you, not because we've changed our minds, but because actually we don't need to be in a kosher sukkah because we are shluchei mitzvah. Look at Rashi. Shluchei mitzvah anan, says Rashi. Here. Lahadbil pnei Rosh Galuta. We've come to visit the Rosh Galuta. We've come to see the leader of the generation. To chayiv Adam lahadbil pnei Rabba beregel. Because we'll see later on Daf Chaf Chei Amud Aleph that there is a mitzvah to go and visit your Rebbe on Yom Tov.
But he wasn't the rabbinical authority, was he? He was the secular authority in some ways.
He was the titular head of
the community.
Jewry. Huh?
Of the community he was head of.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily they went to him for a psika.
No. No, but they were showing kavod to him. They were showing kavod to him, and therefore they were osek with mitzvah. Yeah, yeah. And therefore they're exempt because the snan, as we learn in the Mishnah later on, on Daf Chaf Hey Amud Aleph, shluchei mitzvah b'turim min sukkah. Those who are on the way to do a mitzvah are exempt from sukkah. So, for example, if you're traveling to go and do a mitzvah somewhere, and you can't, there's no sukkah around, you're potter because you're osek with mitzvah, potter min a mitzvah. We have a principle. Look at Tosfos at the bottom, towards the bottom of the page. Here, shluchei mitzvah. So they say shluchei mitzvah. Anan, we are shluchei mitzvah. Ukugon shahayu mitbatlin min ha-mitzvahs. Therefore, it's like if we are exempt from mitzvahs, or this mitzvah itself is nullified. Since we weren't able, if we were to have to go and find another sukkah, we wouldn't be able to fulfill this mitzvah. That's why, therefore, we can stay in this sukkah because we're involved in that mitzvah. Okay. So I want to share with you the Ritva, because the Ritva asks a fascinating question. Because what's going on here? Rav Nachman knew that Rav Chista and Rabbi Huna don't agree with him. And it appears like Davka, he put them in a sukkah to see what would happen. That he knew they didn't hold by. So says the Ritva. So Rav Chista, Rabbi Huna, Ikle lebei Reish Galuta. So they went to visit the Reish Galuta, and Rav Nachman put them in a sukkah where the decorations were lower than 4 tefachim. Perish v'akavav da'akati lo yada Rabban Gamliel da'hadru mishmate. So even though we didn't know that they'd gone back on their word, and therefore this where he was putting them was something that was forbidden for them. And he was causing them to dwell in apostle sukkah. If they were in that sukkah and then they were to make the bracha leishev basukkah, they're making a bracha on something that they don't hold by, and therefore they're not making a correct bracha. Because according to them, you wouldn't be able, according to Rav Chista and Rabbi Bahana, you wouldn't be able to make a bracha in such a sukkah because it's not a kosher sukkah according to them. So what Rav Nachman has done is he's put them in a situation, it's a michshol, it's a stumbling block. He's causing them to do something unwittingly. How can that be right? That can't be right. So says the Ritva, Yesh omrim timeha shemeinin shema achil lechaveru mashu mutaloi lefi daso. He says we can compare this to a situation of this. What happens if someone comes to eat in your house and you hold by a certain standard of kashrus, but they hold it by a different standard? What should you serve them? What you hold or what they hold? So let's say they only eat glut kosher meat. You eat regular kosher meat. You know that they only eat glut kosher. They come to your house. What should you serve them? It would be obvious. It makes sense to say, well, you should serve them what they eat, only what they eat. But so similar cases. So it says we can learn. He says, I see where he's getting this from. Just looking at the footnotes where he gets this from. From apostle. Yeah. So he says, if you were to feed them what you considered to be fit to eat, that wouldn't be considered placing a stumbling block before the blind. And even though you know that according to his opinion, this is forbidden to him, this person is someone who knows how to rule things, pascha. And this is the type of person who is fit to rule on these things, and people rely on his opinions for others, for himself and for others to go according to his opinion. So he says it very interestingly. He says, in this case, it's slightly different because here it's quite obvious to them that this is forbidden. When they walk into that sukkah, they can quite clearly see that the decorations are hanging lower than 4 tefachim. However, if it wouldn't have been clear, then you wouldn't be able to do so. So if your friend won't be able to wouldn't know the difference. So if you put something in front of them, or put them in a situation where it's quite clear to them, they know whether it's right or not. It's clear to them, then you've not transgressed the prohibition of putting a stumbling block before the blind, because they're clearly not blind. They can, figuratively and literally, they can see what's in front of them. Yeah. So it would appear from this that Rav Nachman didn't do anything wrong, because Rav Chisda and Rav Bahuna could easily see that the decorations were lower than 4 tefachim, and therefore they would have been able to make their own decision. I was to carry on in the Ritva, because Ritva now says, when he says to them, again, it doesn't necessarily seem to fit with the language of the Morah, though, because he says to them, have you gone back on your opinion? They say, no. It does fit, I suppose. They say to him, no, we're shluchim mitzvah. So says the Ritva, what does it mean they are shluchim mitzvah and therefore potter from this sukkah? Perish, but she efshar lekaima shtehem. We have this principle of osek b'mitzvah potter min a mitzvah. A person who's involved in one mitzvah is exempt from another mitzvah. But that doesn't mean, that's not a blanket ruling. It means if it's impossible for you to do the two things at the same time, then you're exempt. So in this case, if they were going to start looking for a kosher sukkah, then they'd be so involved in that, they wouldn't be able to fulfill this mitzvah of visiting the Reish Galuta. However, if it is possible for them to fulfill both, if it would be easy for them just to move into a kosher sukkah somewhere else and still be able to visit the Reish Galuta, then they wouldn't be exempt from the mitzvah sukkah on account of the principle of involvement in one mitzvah exempts you from another. And it goes on to say, and he quotes the Mechilta. Mechilta says something interesting. What about, Mechilta says, Ha'osek b'Torah potter min ha'tefillin. Mechilta says, what about a person, Mechilta says, makes a statement, somebody who's involved in learning Torah is exempt from putting on tefillin, because they're osek the mitzvah, potter min a mitzvah, it would appear. Hold on a second, but learning Torah doesn't preclude you. We've said that you're only exempt from the other mitzvah if you can't do the same two things simultaneously. But clearly you could be able to put on tefillin and continue learning Torah. You shouldn't be exempt. Why is Mechilta say you're exempt? So says Ritva, the reason the Mechilta says you were exempt in that case is Lav Mahai Timer Hutaha Efshal Kaim Shteyim. It's not for this reason that you're involved in mitzvah and therefore you're exempt from doing the other mitzvah, because you could do the two together. Here the reason is, since a person is involved in their learning, since a person's involved, concentrating on their learning, if they were to stop and put on tefillin require us also to concentrate on them. It's the idea of hesech hadas. When you're wearing tefillin, you have to be very careful what you do. And that's why originally people used to wear tefillin all day. But you had to be very careful to keep a guf noki. For example, you had to keep the body clean. You had to keep, obviously, thoughts on things which are appropriate for tefillin. And therefore, that's why, since that's very, very difficult, we don't wear tefillin all day now. We only wear them while we're davening. So at least while we're davening, you should at least be in the state where it's fit to be concentrating on it. So since there's a requirement to concentrate on the tefillin while you're wearing the tefillin, that means your concentration will be diverted from your learning. And therefore, it's impossible to do the two things at once. And that's why, according to the Chilta, if you're learning Torah, meaning you're really learning Torah and concentrating on it, you'll be exempt from putting on tefillin. Interesting. Okay, I think now we'd say nowadays we're not able to concentrate that much on our learning, and therefore we wouldn't be exempt from wearing tefillin. In the footnotes, he says the Rishalmi nitnu tam acher. He says shetamat tefillin leman tia Torah asher beficha. The Rishalmi brings down another reason, which is the reason why we put on tefillin is because basically on the pasuk that says leman tia Torah Hashem beficha, in order that the Torah of Hashem shall be in your mouth. So if you're learning Torah, you've already got the words of Hashem in your mouth. There's no need for tefillin. So it's not a case of being osek with mitzvah possible in a mitzvah. So all this idea of terudah, of being having to concentrate hevesek hadas, but since the whole purpose of wearing tefillin is in order that you talk about words of Torah, well, if you're learning Torah, then there's no need for them. So that's another reason why you wouldn't need to put them on if you're learning Torah. He says, however, aval bezman kriyas shema tefillah tzarich lahaniach kadei shekabel alav ol malchut shamayim shalema. So although if you're learning Torah, you would be, according to the Mechilta, exempt from putting on tefillin, because the whole purpose of tefillin is the words of Torah should be in your mouth. If you're learning Torah, then they are automatically. When it comes to the time in davening, when you say Shema and the Amidah, where we're accepting upon ourselves the yoke of heaven, then you definitely, even if you're learning Torah, you'd have to interrupt it to put on tefillin, because that when you're saying those things, when you're saying Shema and Amidah, there's a requirement to be mekabel ol malchut shamayim in a complete way, which requires us to wear tefillin. That's why if a person is in a situation where they're not able to wear tefillin for the whole of davening, someone's in a massive rush or in a situation where it's just not appropriate to be davening, when a person puts on tefillin, they should at least say the Shema and the Amidah while they're wearing the tefillin. That's the minimum a person should say while they're wearing it. Okay. So that I thought was an interesting idea from the Ritva on there. Let's go back in the Gemara. Okay, we go back a little bit to our subject of the sheets laid out in the sukkah. Yeah. So see the line begins with the asterisk, end of the line. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. So Shmuel says, Mutzalishan bekila besukkah, afal pi sheyesh la gag, v'hu she'ena gavoa asara. So says Shmuel, a person is permitted to sleep under a kila. Says Rashi, kila is a pursa sevivios hamita. Again, it's like a four-poster bed, but this time it's not only is it covered on top, but all the way around, completely enclosed. And even though it's got a complete roof over the top of it, way more than a tefach, not like the naklitin we said. Remember, we said we had those two cases at the beginning of the Gemara of the four-poster bed and the two-poster bed, where the naklitin is the two-poster bed is the sheet is sloping off at an angle. There's no roof to it. So even though it has a proper roof to it, Ela Shavek Shel Kinofos, and even though it is just like a four-poster bed, and then when we already said that if someone is underneath a four-poster bed in a sukkah, that is considered to be an ohel, and therefore the sukkah is possible. Here we say, even if that's the case, says Shmuel, a person is permitted to sleep underneath it in the sukkah, even though it's got a roof. Why? As long as it's not at the height of 10 tefachim. So that the covering, as long as the covering is lower than 10 tefachim, then it's fine. Says Rashi, v'hu she'enu gavoa asara min ha'mitzah shebatze migova asara lav ohalahu. As long as the covering on top of the bed is less than 10 tefachim above the bed, it's not considered to be an ohel, because we said that an ohel is a minimum of 10 tefachim high. So although you're completely encircled by it and surrounded by it, and it has a proper roof over the top of you, as long as it's lower than 10 tefachim, you can sleep underneath it in the sukkah. Gemara carries on, actually, and now challenges that. Says Gemara, Tashima, hold on a second, can challenge it from a brisa. Yeah, Tashima. Says the Gemara, Tashima, let's learn from another brisa. Yasham bekila b'sukkah lo yatzli deichovasoi. We have a brisa which seems to completely contradict it, that says the person someone who sleeps underneath us under a killer, this type of bed, hasn't fulfilled their obligation, meaning it's possible. Says the Gemara, Hakab Mayaskin, and what are we dealing with here? Kushevoa Asara. Oh, that's obviously talking about, that brisa was obviously talking about when the killer, when the covering was above 10 tefachim, and therefore, since then it's now an ohel, that's why it's possible. You haven't fulfilled your obligation. Says the Gemara, Gemara doesn't give up. It says Meisvei, objection. Hayashan, from another brisa, later on Chaf Amud Beis. Hayashin tachas hamitza b'sukkah lo yatzi deichavasoi. Says the brisa, a person who sleeps underneath a bed in a sukkah hasn't fulfilled their obligation. Again, it would appear to contradict what we've just said, what Shmuel just said. So says the Gemara, Hatugama Shmuel b'mitzah gavoa asara. No, Shmuel has already explained that's talking about when the bed is higher than 10 tefachim. But if it's less, then it's not a problem. Gemara tries again, Tashima, or Shapiris al gabe kinofos pasula. Very similar to what we had in our case. Yeah, in the brisa right at the beginning of the Gemara on Yud Amud Beis. Yud Amud Aleph. Yeah, this kinofos. Shapiris al gabe kinofos. Kinofos is the four-poster bed. It doesn't have the sides though. Four-poster bed. If you spread a sheet over it, it's possible. Says the Gemara, Hasam Nami to Gavi Asara. That was also talking about when it was higher than 10 tefachim. Says the Gemara, Vahalo Katani. But that wasn't taught there. You can't. How can you suggest that was above 10 tefachim when it doesn't say that at all there? Says Rashi, but B'Brais to Mefarish Lahu Begova Tahachi Tana Niklitin Shnayim. We learned about the niklitin, this sloping bed that was two from Mefrishas El, as we've explained above. Yotzin, be'emsa mitzah le'merosheha v'ragleha. It has one post at one end, one at the other end, one at the foot of the bed, one at the head of the bed, and the sheet runs across the top. So hachi lokatani hachi. We didn't teach that here. The Tanya niklitin. Shnayim v'kinofos arba'a. We saw in that brisa over there, right at the beginning of the Gemara, that a niklitin is this bed, two-poster bed, and the kinofos is a four-poster bed. Puris al gabe kinofos basula, al gabe niklitin kashera. There we said if you just spread a sheet over the four-poster bed, it's possible, but over the two-poster bed, it's kosher. Ubilvad shlo yiyu niklitin guvoe min hamitza asara. And that's what we mean is that as long as the niklitin is not higher than 10 tefachim, miklal. So says the Gemara, hold on, that would imply to kinofos afal pi she'en gavoim asara. that would imply that if you made that distinction about the niklitim but not about the kinofos, we can infer that with the kinofos, the four-poster bed, even if it's not higher than 10 tefachim, it's still possible. So still seems to contradict what Shmuel was saying. So says the Gemara, shiny kinofos. No, a kinofos is different to a kila, as we said. Why? The kavia. Because the posts, the post on the four-poster bed of the kinofos is fixed. Whereas on the kila, it doesn't seem to be fixed. Yeah, look at Rashi, to kivia, aval kila lo kivia, the chazaka, kinofos. There's a difference between this bed called a kila and the bed called a kinofos. The kinofos, the what are they? So the posts and the beams are fixed permanently, and therefore, as soon as you put a sheet over it, regardless of what height it is, it's now an ohel because it has a fixed status. Whereas the kila, the posts and the boards, beams going around aren't always there. And therefore, if you were to put them there and then put a sheet over it, as long as it's less than 10 tefachim, we say it doesn't have a definition of an ohel. It's still something temporary. Says Rashi, and therefore, when it comes to the kila, as long as it's less than 10 tefachim, we don't consider it to be an ohel. Whereas with the kinofos, even if it's less than 10 tefachim, we would consider it to be an ohel because of its permanency. Says the Gemara doesn't give up here. It's like a dog with a bone here. Says the Gemara, well, hold on a second. Okay, that's the reason why. Well, hold on a second. What about Vahare? Beginning of the next line. Vahare sukkah agabe sukkah to What about the case of a sukkah on top of the sukkah, which is clearly something permanent and it's something has a certain permanency to it? Why? Because that's definitely going to be a minimum of 10 tefachim. For the sukkah to be kosher anyway, the bottom one and the top one, they both have to be minimum of 10 tefachim. As soon as you hit the 10 tefachim mark, it's automatically considered to be something of permanence, of chashivas, because that's the minimum definition of an ohel. So once it hits 10 tefachim, it's an ohel. So therefore, we've got a sukkah on top of a sukkah, and yet we sometimes say, with the sukkah on top of a sukkah, the lower one can be kosher if the schach of the upper one is not. But hold on a second, how can that be? To kaviyah, it's something fixed. V'amar Shmuel k'harasheruk kach basula. And he said, and Shmuel himself said, just as something makes something kosher, meaning you need 10 tefachim to make something kosher, that's the minimum height, kach basula, so also the same thing will make it possible. So as once you hit 10 tefachim, you have a kosher sukkah. But once you hit 10 tefachim with a sukkah on top of a sukkah, that makes the other one possible. You can't have it both ways. So Amri, so it says, so we answer, the Shmuel will answer, Amri Hasam to Lemivsal Sukkah Ba'asara. There we said that we use 10 tefachim as a way of postling the lower sukkah. Hacha to the Shaive Oyela Batsim Yasara Nami Have Ole. Whereas here, what we're trying to establish is, at what point does this covering over the bed become an ohel? So we'll say up to 10 tefachim is okay. More than 10 tefachim would be possible. Says Rashi, where is it? Hacha, yeah, here. Hacha, end of the line. Hacha, the Shabbat Ohele, when we're here measuring or establishing something as an ohel, Shlo Yashan Taktav, whether you shouldn't sleep underneath it. Aval, Shah Sukkah Kashera, whereas the rest of the sukkah is kosher. So we can't really learn one from the other. When you're saying 10 tefachim of a full sukkah will posel the lower sukkah, that's when you've already got a whole sukkah. Here we're just talking about something within a sukkah, a bed. You've got a kosher sukkah already, and inside that kosher sukkah, you've got a bed. So we say, as long as the covering of the bed is less than 10 tefachim, we don't consider that to be an ohel, because the majority of the rest of the sukkah is kosher. It's just a small area within the sukkah has something in it which is not ideal, but as long as it doesn't go beyond 10 tefachim, we say, you know what? We won't postle the whole sukkah on account of that. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. I think we're going to leave it there. The Moradal goes on and says, yeah. Amarav Tachlifa. I'm Shmuel. Bekila Arum Motzi Rosha Chutz. The more I'm going to talk about what happens. Although we won't consider this something to postle the sukkah, can we consider that? And therefore, we're not. Sorry, since we're not considering anything less than 10 tefachim as an ohel, therefore it's not going to postle the sukkah of if it's a covering of a kila. Can we consider it to be enough of an ohel to separate a person who's not wearing anything to be able to say Shema if they were to put their head outside of this bed? So can we almost like split the definition of it's enough of a covering in order to consider to be an interruption between a person's body and their head for purposes of saying Shema, where even though we've now established that it's not considered to be too much of a separation that would postle the whole sukkah.
When you say the whole sukkah, do you mean the area underneath the netting? Or the entire whole sukkah?
Well, yeah, the area underneath that, as well as the rest of the sukkah that's not underneath it.
Okay.
That's how we've landed. We've said the distinction between our last challenge was you've got one kosher sukkah on top of another one. Yeah?
Yeah.
We've said if that's 10 tefachim, it postles the one below it. Why doesn't the 10 tefachim bed postle the one, postle anything underneath it, meaning the person who's sleeping in it? So we said because we're only using 10 tefachim as a definition of what's considered to be an ohel.
Sure, but if we're talking one underneath another, the one on the lower is not. It's only partly. I don't understand why if you're to the right of the bed with a covering, why if there was a bed with a covering,
yeah,
you couldn't still be in the bit to the side of the bed.
You mean if you're not under the bed, you'd be okay. You would be. Sorry, you would be.
Okay, fine. So when we say we talk about the entire bed, when you say plus with the sukkah, we're talking about the bed and the frame effectively is the.
What we mean is if you were to be under that bed the whole time, it's if you're in the postle sukkah.
Got it. Okay.
So you're right. So that's a good point. We haven't postled the sukkah, but it's as if you're under a postle sukkah.
Got it.
Yeah, sorry, I should be more clear about that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you.
But yet we're still making a distinction between a postle sukkah, postling a whole sukkah because of another sukkah on top of it. Here we're saying we're not going to do that as long as it's less than 10 tefachim. We'll say we won't consider that to be enough of something to postle the whole sukkah, or that the fact that when you're underneath it, it's as if you're under a postle sukkah. That's the point.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for making that point. Okay. All right, we'll leave it there. So we'll carry on next time and see this idea of can we make now another distinction between that area underneath that bed and being outside of it. Is it considered to be enough of a separation between part of you and the rest of you? All right.
Thank you.